From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Kaylee Lyons, I'm Joe Matthew.
Donald Trump talking about the economy at a rally in North Carolina, still ongoing, just days before Kamala Harris will do the same. It comes against a backdrop of cooling inflation with today's inline CPI data.
We'll get reaction from the White House with Jared Bernstein, chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, and from Douglas Holtz-Eakin, president of the American Action Forum.
Plus, we'll be joined by Evelyn Farkas of the McCain Institute as negotiators head to Doha for talks tomorrow on a ceasefire in Gaza without Hamas in attendance, and as Iran and its proxies keep Israel in suspense over a potential retaliatory attack. Welcome to Balance of Power on this CPI day, and noteworthy, Joe, that on a day in which we get cooler inflation data, we are hearing Donald Trump still in North Carolina talking about the economy just 2 days before we expect the vice president to outline her economic plan. Also in that swing state.
They both chose North Carolina. Interesting. He's still rolling here. And Kaylee, it's been not unlike his acceptance speech at the RNC. A little bit of teleprompter, a little bit of ad-libbing, and we carry on. It has not been all about the economy, but the former president, did make some promises, speaking moments ago in North Carolina. Let's listen.
From today and from the day I take the oath of office, we will rapidly drive prices down and make America affordable again.
Of course, the U.S. inflation data we saw today did show prices going down, easing for a fourth consecutive month in July, which keeps the Federal Reserve on track to lower interest rates in September. Joining us now for a reaction from the White House and the North Lawn of it is Jared Bernstein, chair of the Council of Economic Advisors. Welcome back to Bloomberg, Mr. Chairman. Always great to have you. When we look at the data today, on the surface, obviously looks good, pretty much in line. Then you get to the sticky part. Shelter costs contributed to 90% of the inflation we did see. This is something we've talked about a lot, Jared. How confident are you that some of that can unstick in the remaining months of this administration?
Well, first of all, nice to talk to both of you again, and it's great to see a CPI report with a 2 handle, 2.9% year over year, and of course, 0.2 for both headline and core over the month. And by the way, those are soft 2s, soft 0.2s, 0.15 on headline and 0.17 on core. So these days, everybody goes to the second decimal place, and that's a soft 0.2. In terms of shelter, yeah, it's stickier than I think we and many others would like. And the fact of the matter is that we have a housing shortage in this country that's been in the making for 10 years running. But 2 things to consider about that. One is that housing's contribution to the price index has been going down. It's been coming in. It's been contributing to the easing that I think has dominated much of this discussion today. Would we like it to come down faster and contribute more to that easing? Absolutely. And in fact, if we look at rents, we've seen them roll over in a way that many of us keep thinking would show up in the CPI. We saw more of that in June than we did in July. But directionally, it is moving in the right direction. And of course, the second point is we are taking really aggressive action to try to lower costs in the housing space. We had an important announcement on that earlier this week, and I'm happy to go through some of that. We also have a congressional agenda that we believe will add 2 million affordable units to the housing stock. That's a huge difference in terms of the affordable supply. So lots more work to do there, but we've already been rolling up our sleeves on that one.
Well, considering the good news, 4 months straight here, Mr. Chairman, a reporter asked the president today, your boss, Joe Biden, about whether the U.S. had at last beat inflation. This is what he had to say in response.
I told you we're going to have a soft landing. We're going to have a soft landing. My policies are working. Start writing that way, okay?
Start writing it that way, he said. Jared, Donald Trump just told the crowd in Asheville that if Kamala Harris was capable of beating inflation, she would just do it right now since she already works at the White House. Considering what the president just said, how do you respond to that?
Well, the forecaster in chief was out in full effect today. I think what he was really doing there was citing the baseline forecast. I mean, if you listen to experts talking about inflation today in the econ Twitterverse or in the media. You heard a lot of sentiment that was very much that the trend is pretty embedded when it comes to disinflation. Obviously, there was a pause in that progress in Q1, but it looks like it's back and back with some strength. One of the numbers I like to cite this morning is Sure, 2.9, got that 2 handle on year-over-year CPI, but it's 2.5 on a 6-month annualized basis, and it's 0.4% on a 3-month annualized basis. What those more near-term annualized rate tells you is that not only are we moving in the right direction, but we have some momentum. And when the president was talking about, a soft landing, I think, again, the baseline forecast is one for a transition to steady, stable growth, where the strong job market continues to support consumer spending. An interesting and important linchpin into that, by the way, is the fact that we now have 17 months in a row of year-over-year wages beating prices for middle wage workers. That's a really important part of what the president was referring to.
Well, the president, the forecaster in chief, obviously, Jared, it is your job to forecast as well. As we talk about this notion of a soft landing, given after the most recent jobs report and the uptick we saw in the unemployment rate, the triggering of the so-called SOM rule, there was a lot of talk about a potential growth scare. Are you as comfortable looking at the labor market with saying that soft landing phrasing out loud as you were maybe a couple months ago?
Well, I think the thing about the labor market is to pay a lot of attention to a cooler than expected report that we saw for July, but not to over-torque or over-index on that report. If you look at payroll gains over the past 3 months, they average 170,000. Okay, that's a good clip. If you look at wage growth, July, 3.6% nominal. 3.8% nominal for middle wage workers, and we've been talking about a 2.9% inflation rate. So wages beating prices. We have, as I often say when we talk about this, we have a 70% consumer spending economy. You've got real wages growing, you've got inflation easing, you have the gas price down about 35%, according to this morning's report, 2.2% decline in gas prices over the past year. All of that supports steady, stable growth. It looks to me where we are right now. We're going to watch the cooling of the job market very carefully, but the baseline forecast is still favorable.
There's been a lot of talk about trading down in this economy, Jared, and we're going to be hearing retail sales numbers later this week. We're going to get earnings as well from Walmart. What does the president's economic advisor, in this case, Jared Bernstein, the chairman, look for and listen for on a day like that when we get a massive news dump from the retail world? What's going to be important to you, and what should our audience listen for?
Well, I think the consumer spending data, as I just mentioned, it's such a big part of the economy. Retail sales is one part of that picture, but of course it covers, a relatively small share. I think we want to look at the consumer spending writ large. We want to look at the part of retail sales that feeds into that, and of course we'll be all over that tomorrow. I'd like to talk about a different indicator right now, though, and it gets to your question, but also to Kayleigh's. One of the really important and I think maybe somewhat underappreciated aspects of the labor market right now is that while we've seen some cooling, it looks like that cooling has come largely from slower hiring rates, not more layoffs. Okay, think of the old bathtub model. If you think of the water in the bathtub as the stock of the unemployed, we haven't seen the flow into the tub increase. That would be people coming into unemployment very much. What we've seen is the flow out slow down some. It's taking people a bit longer to find work, and because the rate of hiring has slowed. So the thing that we don't really see in these jobs data is layoffs, or at least permanent layoffs. We had a spike in temporary layoffs in July. We're not seeing permanent layoffs. And without permanent layoffs, without that kind of increased flow into unemployment, I think it's hard to get really to a more negative place about where the economy is headed. So that's an indicator I'll be watching very carefully.
Great to have you back. Mr. Chairman, at the White House Council of Economic Advisors, Jared Bernstein didn't ask a question about the Fed this time. Let's bring in Jonathan Tamari at Bloomberg Government with our eyes on politics here. Jonathan, it's great to see you. The crossover with the economy and politics is huge, and it's going to get more important as we get closer to November. It seems to really be starting this week with these addresses, the economic framework being rolled out by Kamala Harris. Friday, at least that's the promise. We didn't get a lot in the way of details today from Donald Trump. Is he still going, or did he wrap up here?
He's still
going in Asheville. And it's been really a speech about everything, not so much an economic policy address. You could argue, though, that the stars are aligning a bit for Kamala Harris right now when it comes to economic data, even though she hasn't put out a policy proposal.
Yeah, I mean, it's clearly her biggest weakness, despite all of the energy that Democrats have generated in the time since President Biden dropped out, Kamala Harris secured the nomination. They've seen a lot of positive indicators, polling, volunteers, but the economy is a fundamental thing. It's the most important issue to voters overall. And a lot of Republicans are betting on the fact that once this energy dissipates, the economy will still be the thing that drags down Harris and lifts up Trump. So the way that it gyrates in these next few months could really determine how voters feel come November and not, here in the kind of heat of August.
Well, Donald Trump used the word energy a lot in these remarks that are still ongoing, but in a different way, Jonathan. He talked about unleashing American energy, drill, baby, drill. He specifically talked about the state of Pennsylvania, which he argues Harris cannot win because of her stance on fracking, or maybe more accurate to say former stance on fracking. Yet we saw a new Quinnipiac poll for the state of Pennsylvania. She's beating him by 3 points. And in the new Cook Political Report polling, she's also leading in Pennsylvania. So what does that say?
Well, so partly it says that there's been a really big swing because Democrats were not leading, not by those kind of numbers, when Joe Biden was the nominee. And so we're seeing just how quickly things are changing. And you could argue Pennsylvania, 19 electoral votes, could be the whole ballgame for Democrats. Without that state, very hard for Harris to have a path to victory. I also think that her record has not been fully litigated yet in the state. She's only been the nominee for a number of weeks here. I think Republicans will hammer that message. There's a debate among strategists. Republicans say it's a really key issue for their voters in Pennsylvania, but a lot of Democrats say, no, listen, environmental protections are also important for a lot of voters in those suburban areas that have a lot of votes. So it's not necessarily a fatal thing, but it is something that will be a challenge for her to overcome for sure. And I think we're still to see kind of how the messaging plays out as people grasp what she has said in the past and what she's saying now.
Well, on the subject of environmental protections, Donald Trump did in these remarks suggest that no one actually knows what net zero means, that he doesn't know what net zero means. It'll be interesting to see how that lands in some of the areas you're talking about. Jonathan Tamari of Bloomberg Government, thank you so much. And coming up, we'll continue our conversation about the economy and the economic platforms of these two campaigns. Douglas Holtz-Eakin of the American Action Forum joins us next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio.
CPI is on a really good trajectory. If you look at over the last 3 months, headline CPI is up only 0.4%. That's obviously actually below the Fed's target for annual inflation. The housing number is obviously driving the vast majority of the inflation that we still have. It's incumbent upon both candidates to explain what they plan to do on housing.
And both candidates have that opportunity this week with economic speeches planned. Donald Trump in the midst of his now in North Carolina. Kamala Harris will do hers on Friday in the same state. Thanks for being with us on Balance of Power. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kayleigh Lines. That was the former National Economic Council Deputy Director in this White House, Bharat Ramamurthy, talking with us earlier here on Bloomberg on the heels of the fresh round of inflation data we've been talking about showing U.S. prices that continue to cool. Shelter, housing, though, is an exception. And joining us is Douglas Holtz-Eakin to continue our conversation, the president of the American Action Forum. Douglas, it's great to have you back. Both campaigns are going to be speaking to this issue, but isn't the dirty little secret that neither can do anything to help this housing market?
Not on the timetables that matter for elections. There's no question about that. This is one of the toughest problems we've faced in a long time. We came into the pandemic and the tightening cycle that followed the policy errors with record low inventory in the residential sector, record low vacancies in the rental sector, and with the tightening of monetary policy, no real incentive to fix that problem. So it is a very, very tough nut to crack. Now, I just want to say, you always have to take 1 month's piece of data with a grain of salt. And indeed, the shelter number, 4.1% an annual rate, is the nettlesome part of this report. The rest is pretty solid. And I think people should not be confused and think this is a bad report. This is a good report. It indicates that the Fed is, again, closer to balance of risks on employment and inflation, can contemplate moving toward a more balanced monetary policy. And I think given the things they've said, they're likely to cut 25 basis points in September. That seems to be almost a lock at this point. I think the larger problem, the political problem, since that's this show, is that Kamala Harris as candidate owns the entire 43-month record of the Biden administration. And what you hear my good friend Jared Bernstein and Barat do is cherry pick the record. The record is that for 43 months, they've averaged 5.4% inflation, and wages have not grown at a 5.4% annual rate. So over that 43-month period, people went to work and got further behind. That is the problem that she owns and needs to deal with. The converse problem, just to finish, sorry about that, Kayleigh, Donald Trump is promising to lower prices. He's not going to do that. We are going to get inflation back to the 2% target, but food prices are not going to go back to their 2021 levels, and that is the reality that people are going to have to face. So neither of the conversations that are going on right now are leveling with people about the data.
Well, as we think about the conversations ongoing, Donald Trump is still currently speaking in North Carolina, and it seems that a lot of his ideas as to how to bring down inflation center around energy. He keeps coming back to this idea of drill, baby, drill and deregulating. But Douglas, considering the U.S. is already producing a record amount of oil, does that go anywhere to solving the cost problem that people are facing?
No one's accused Mr. Trump of being a policy-rich candidate. And, this is something that he's latched onto for a number of years now. Certainly it comes from the administration's climate agenda and reduced leasing and limitations on LNG export facilities and things that got a lot of publicity. But the reality is the production of carbon-based fuels, particularly oil and gas, is very, very high. And so this is not the source of the inflation problem. The source of the inflation problem was enormous policy errors in 2021, massive fiscal stimulus that was way too much for what the system could bear, and a Fed that kept its foot on the gas throughout the year. And we're just undoing that, and it takes a long time. This is a great reminder that once you let inflation get embedded in an economy, is a very painful thing to wring it out. And then we're in a 2.5-year process at this point.
Well, what if you make the Trump tax cuts permanent then with no way to pay for it? What does that mean for inflation in a Trump 2.0 White House?
We have seen the Biden administration just continue to do deficit finance spending, right? CHIPS Acts, student loan forgiveness, name everything they've tried. That's not helping the Fed. That is, at full employment, $2 trillion deficits. No one would recommend that as macro policy. To exacerbate it would be completely unwise. And so, I think the most pressing issue facing the U.S. that anyone can see is that there must be some action in 2025 on the sunsets of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. In the absence of action, we get a 4.2 over 10 years, $1 trillion taxing increase. No one thinks that's a good idea. What then is the plan? How will one get from here now to the end game? And no one's talking about that. And that's what's really missing on policy platforms.
Well, we're glad to have you to talk to about that. Douglas Holtz-Eakin, president of the American Action Forum. Hope to see you back soon. Thank you for joining. This is Bloomberg.
Today, the Teamsters are here to say we are not beholden to anyone or any party. I don't care about getting criticized. It's an honor to be the first Teamster in our 121-year history to address the Republican National Convention.
The Teamsters President Sean O'Brien addressing the RNC last month at the invitation of former President Donald Trump. That was then. Fast forward to today, Donald Trump drawing criticism from labor leaders, including O'Brien, after comments he made during the interview he conducted with Tesla CEO Elon Musk.
I look at what you do. You walk in and you just say, you want to quit? They go on strike. I won't mention the name of the company, but they go on strike and you say, that's okay. You're all gone. You're all gone. So every one of you is gone.
On Tuesday, the Teamsters Black Caucus officially endorsing Vice President Kamala Harris. Sean O'Brien telling Politico, quote, firing workers for organizing, striking, and exercising their rights as Americans is economic terrorism, unquote. Joining us now, Ian Kullgren of Bloomberg Law. Ian, Mr. O'Brien also said he hasn't received an invitation yet to the DNC. Does he show up in Chicago? Did Donald Trump just lose the Teamsters?
Well, unclear. We'll see. I'm told as of a few minutes ago, too, that the Teamsters have not heard back from the Harris campaign about their invitation to have her to headquarters either. So there is this sort of deafening silence on the part of the Democrats after O'Brien would speak at the RNC.
Well, it's fascinating to behold. It's also worth considering at this time last year, we were talking about a red hot labor summer. It extended into the fall. We still have a few months to go before this election. We know that ports on the East Coast are going to be dealing with potentially some strike activity. What should we be on watch for other than endorsements?
Certainly. Well, unions are going to have to communicate to their members and are starting to communicate to their members about what to expect as the economy tries to cool off. And that is going to be important as they try to organize members to get out the vote for Kamala Harris. The UAW is having a big all-members call this evening, actually, to kick off its formal campaign, which I'm told by a source in the union is actually bigger in reach than any they've done previously. It's going to be in 26 states with focus on Michigan, obviously, their home, but it's going to be a lot of places, too.
Are we going to see another situation if Sean O'Brien endorses the Democratic ticket where leadership is with Democrats, rank and file, or with Donald Trump?
Well, I think it's important to note and consider the fact that the Teamsters have not solidly been in the camp of Democrats throughout their history. I mean, they endorsed Reagan twice. They endorsed George H.W. Bush. They endorsed Richard Nixon. I mean, they really didn't endorse Democrats until 1992 when they endorsed Bill Clinton and have pretty much endorsed Democrats since then. So this is a situation where the membership is mixed, and I think that is reflected in how President O'Brien is handling this, trying to give every candidate a fair hearing and have a methodical process to make a decision. And members are also voting on who they want to, which is going to be a big part of it.
Certainly. Ian Kullgren of Bloomberg Law, thank you so much for joining us. We'll have much more ahead on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV. Evelyn Farkas of the McCain Institute will join us with an eye on the Middle East. This is Bloomberg.
This region has now suffered enough, and the more time goes by of escalated tensions, the more time goes by of daily conflict, the more the odds and the chances go up for accidents, for mistakes, for inadvertent targets to be hit that could easily cause escalation that gets out of control.
Amos Hochstein, Deputy Assistant to President Biden, as he meets with Lebanon's Parliament Speaker earlier today. Hochstein's engaging in shuttle diplomacy as we speak between Lebanon and Israel as ceasefire talks are now expected to resume tomorrow in Qatar. We're joined at this important moment by Evelyn Farkas, Executive Director of the McCain Institute at Arizona State University. Evelyn, it's great to have you back on Bloomberg TV and radio. I don't know how you're looking at the potential for a ceasefire here as we wait for a retaliatory strike reportedly by Iran against Israel. But to pick up on what Hochstein was just saying, how long can we have such a mass of American military hardware in the theater and have Iran in this crouched position before something bad happens?
Yeah, I mean, Joe, I don't know how long. How long can U.S. forces stay on, on point, on alert? I think fairly long as we need them to. But what Hochstein was saying there is that, and I worked with him in the previous administration, he was saying that every day that we have the Iranians poised to make an attack is a day where the risk of real escalation and all-out war, a full, multiple front war in Israel increases. And what I heard when I was in Israel in June from the retired Israeli Defense Forces commanders, the IDF commanders, was that if an attack came from the north, from Hezbollah, that the likely problem for them would be that the Iron Dome, that the existing defenses would not be able to protect the Israeli citizens, and so that some of these missiles would go as far as Tel Aviv. And that's to say nothing of what Iran has in store. And most of the people in the Pentagon, I was there last week, they don't expect anything worse than the strikes that Iran launched against Israel last April. But that's, they don't really know actually what's going to happen. So we're at a very dangerous moment in time, and negotiations, as you know, appear stalled. And that is what Hezbollah is looking for in order to, and Iran, frankly, as an excuse maybe, to halt further escalation. They want to see peace. They want to see an agreement.
Well, this is exactly what we were discussing on this program yesterday with Aaron David Miller of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. This is what he told us, Evelyn, and then we'll have you respond.
That Israeli-Lebanese border is not going to stabilize or de-escalate unless you can get an Israeli-Hamas agreement. And right now, even though Middle East negotiations traditionally have two speeds, slow and slower, this one does not look good. That's the real problem here. At some point, the Iranians and Hezbollah are going to respond. The only hope to avert a major escalation is a ceasefire deal, and I just don't see it coming together right now.
And Evelyn, considering Hamas isn't even going to be at the table in Qatar tomorrow, do you see one coming together?
I see very slim likelihood for that, Kayleigh. I mean, first of all, as you said, Hamas won't be at the table. Hamas is now also led by Yahya Sinwar, who was the architect of the October attack on Israel, because, of course, the Israelis assassinated the negotiator, the political leader, recently in Iran. And frankly, the situation looks as bad when you look at Israel, because you have the far right cabinet minister, Ben-Gvir, basically declaring another, legalizing, which is not an international law term. It's just in Israeli parlance and in the domestic context, saying that we're going to take more territory from the Palestinians in the West Bank, which is another part of Israel that can become inflamed. So we're talking Gaza in the south, we're talking in the north, the conflict with Hezbollah, and the more pressure these far-right politicians put on the West Bank. And also, I should note that he went, this far-right leader went to the holy sacred site of the Muslims, the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. This is off limits, and even Netanyahu basically rebuked him. But these far-right politicians in Israel are also trying to stop any ceasefire, any hostage exchange. And frankly, if you believe that these hostages should be rescued, you should be infuriated at what's going on right now on the Israeli side as well.
Well, Evelyn, as the Pentagon invests itself in defending Israel here against a possible attack, another one by Iran, they're also watching what's happening at an incredible moment right now in Ukraine. And I'd like to ask you for your thoughts on this, as you have spent so much time in Ukraine and covering the situation there. Rebecca Grant, a senior fellow at the Lexington Institute, spent some time with us a little bit earlier as Ukraine continues this cross-border incursion into the Kursk region of Russia. Russia had to shoot down over 100 drones last night. And we talked about Ukraine's goal in this offensive, now almost 2 weeks old, Evelyn. Here's what she said.
Ukraine, with this surprise flank attack, has really opened up a new chapter. It shows that Ukraine's forces have been very well trained by several NATO partners, and they're really very, very capable. The question now is, are they going for a particular objective? Will they then consolidate, or at some point will they pull back?
What's your thought on this, Evelyn, in terms of an objective? Is this a fleeting moment to boost morale in Ukraine, or can they get a foothold here?
I mean, Joe, I can't say for sure. It's interesting because I also had a chance to talk to Pentagon officials about this current situation. And they were really kind of funny. They said, we weren't told ahead of time. They had real operational security here, and they don't know. I think that Zelensky probably has multiple objectives in mind and, has the flexibility. Clearly, his command is unified. They're working in a really concerted fashion. And if it looks like they need to withdraw, they will withdraw. It still will be a victory for them because as President Zelensky has pointed out, he's got some prisoners he can swap. The Ukrainians have shown that they can take advantage of the Russians. They can take the offensive. And, as your analyst before said, they are conducting, serious, concerted, organized military operations. So, I think that it's unclear exactly what they're going to get out of this, but I think the Ukrainians are hedging their bets. They may have to negotiate at some point. They may want to negotiate. Russia is probably not likely to negotiate until after the U.S. elections, though.
Well, so, Evelyn, I guess it raises the broader question for me of whether or not this incursion from Ukraine prolongs the war or brings it closer to its end.
I think at this point, again, it's unclear. However, if they use these positions to continue to take out airfields and air defense and sort of real serious Russian capabilities, and I suppose potentially they can also impact, Russian morale. Clearly, civilians are fleeing their towns. It could start a dynamic that ultimately leads to the Russians being forced to the negotiating table, but I don't expect that overnight. And so I think it's probably more, Kayleigh, on the, hasten us to peace side of the equation than delay, because the stalemate was delaying us.
All right. Evelyn Farkas of the McCain Institute with insights from inside the Pentagon. Thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate your time. And coming up, Congresswoman Ilhan Omar wins her primary in Minnesota in a victory for progressives. We'll have more on that with our political panel after the break. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Say, we run the politics of joy. That's right. Because we know it is joyful to fight for your neighbors. We know it is joyful to make sure everybody has access to health care.
Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, member of the Progressive Squad, last night after handily winning the primary battle for her seat. She's expected to win again in November. Our political panel is with us now for more here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Ashley Davis, founding partner at Westfront Strategies, and Caitlin Legacki, partner at Four Corners Public Affairs. So, Caitlin, obviously, this primary race was one we were watching very closely, as we had already seen two squad members, Cori Bush and Jamal Bowman, go down in their primaries, in part because of the Israel and Gaza issue, but in part because AIPAC money was at play. Wasn't as much in this race. Is that what saved her?
I think, honestly, the thing that saved her is that she's very plugged into her community, and within her district, she's very active. And so, I certainly don't agree with her on a lot of issues, but I respect the fact that she has, despite traveling back and forth from D.C., she has kept very close roots in her district and in her community, and I think that ability to organize her voters is what saved her last night.
Ashley, is there something good for Republicans when it comes to the squad? This has been something that you could frame and use as a cudgel against Democrats. Is it good for Republicans to have
Absolutely. And on the Democrat side, it's the same for the Freedom Caucus or Tea Party or whatever you want to call us over the years. But absolutely, it's a good thing to run against, right? I mean, but I also, and I think you would agree, AIPAC decided not to go into her race. Right. So, and which means to me that they knew that she was not beatable, and that you're right. I mean, if you stay close to your community, you're not going to lose your election. So, I mean, I think it's positive for Republicans that we have a couple squad members left, but we have a lot more
smaller squad.
smaller squad.
But remarkably,
but we have a lot more, Freedom Caucus people
a larger
on our
group
side
by far.
But we did lose the big one.
Bob Good.
Bob Good lost.
So much for the recount.
Yeah.
Interesting, though, to see this is playing as good news on both sides of the table. Our political panel coming up.
Well, we said we love each other.
I know you do. And Ashley Davis are going to stay with us as we spend some time here on the broader presidential race, the massive amount of money being dumped into 7 swing states the rest of this month. It's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Vote Trump and your incomes will soar, your savings will grow, young people will be able to afford a home, and we will bring back the American dream bigger, better, and stronger than ever before.
Donald Trump, a bit earlier today, in a speech that just wrapped up, actually, billed originally as outlining details of Donald Trump's economic vision. It seemed a lot more like a stump speech. We didn't get a lot of details on the economy ahead of Kamala Harris's speech, billed just the same way for Friday in the same swing state of North Carolina. We reassemble our political panel. Caitlin Legacki, Ashley Davis are back with us now at the table. It's wonderful to have you both here. Ashley, this felt a little bit like Milwaukee. We had the teleprompter
how long
there.
Was the speech?
The panels were there. It went on
over an hour.
About that long, actually.
Yeah.
And he was kind of toggling between some pre-written comments about the economy and then riffing on some of the retribution stuff, Democrats stealing the election and so forth. We didn't get a really cohesive economic message beyond what we've long heard. Drill, baby, drill. If you lower energy prices, inflation, the rest of prices of everything will follow. Did he just create a big opening for Kamala Harris on Friday to get more specific?
Well, I looked at what she's supposed to be talking about, and she's supposed to be talking about cutting taxes and helping with the middle class. I mean, so I don't know what that means. And obviously, I don't know if you're sitting in Iowa, if you're sitting in Western Pennsylvania, if you know what that means in regards to legislation. But Trump has 3 pillars that he should be talking about, which is drill, baby drill, I guess. I've been opening up energy policy or stopping regulation. He has keeping his tax policies in place. And then he also has the tariffs, continuing tariffs and tougher tariffs on China. That's the message. And I think that that's the message people resonate with. I don't know. I think that we are causing our own issues by not just sticking to our policies and talking about what people believe in. But I think it does open a door for her because she can actually lay out what she wants to.
Yeah.
On the same side, though, before I hand it over to you, I think that she has the economy wrapped around her neck right now because of she's vice president to Joe Biden. So how does she differentiate herself? And I think she has an opportunity.
Well, on this idea of trying to really narrow and stick with different policy messages, we are now starting to see other Republican presidential candidates who are now in Donald Trump's corner, outwardly endorsing him. Vivek Ramaswamy is one, but also Nikki Haley with some critical words about the way things are going right now. She spoke on Fox yesterday about how she thinks the party is doing right now and what they need to do to win the election.
The Republican Party needs to make a serious shift here. And the first thing is the Republican Party, Donald Trump, people here at Fox, quit complaining that she's not giving an interview. You don't need an interview from Kamala Harris. I take her at her word. Now, what Donald Trump needs to do is go out there and campaign every single day, telling the American people exactly what Kamala Harris has said. One thing Republicans have to stop doing, quit whining.
Quit whining is what she says, but also stop making a big deal about the interview. It is true, though. We haven't seen a Kamala Harris interview to this point. And in the absence of that, what we are seeing is her gaining some serious momentum in polls, including the latest from the Cook Political Report that shows her leading in every single swing state with the exception of Nevada. So if you're the Harris campaign right now, Caitlin, are you thinking you might want to try an interview and see what happens?
I think that, to your point, there's not a lot of demand from voters that she needs to sit down tomorrow and do an interview. We have seen her taking questions from reporters on the tarmac and being available that way. But if I were on the Harris campaign, I would tell her to get through the convention, focus on knocking that out of the park, and then there'll be plenty of time for sit-down interviews after that.
That does seem to be the plan at the moment. We're going to get the speech Friday. I just wonder if this fragile lead that we're seeing that kind of came out of nowhere in less than a month could be at jeopardy, could be in jeopardy as soon as she starts detailing policy proposals. You just highlighted her main challenge, to find sunlight between herself and Joe Biden. Is that possible?
There's 86 days or 85 days. I don't remember the exact days, but I mean, I think that she is going to have to come out with policies. However, it's such a short campaign. And I mean, there's nothing in our history that we've ever witnessed this in modern history. And so I think she should take advantage of it. I mean, if I'm on your side of the aisle, I mean, I think that she does not need to do an interview before the convention. I mean, I'm surprised she's doing her economic speech before the convention. I think it's probably a little pressure. But she's going to ride a high, and I don't think we see true polls until mid-September.
Well, we are seeing polls now.
No,
though,
I mean like true poll.
Okay,
I mean,
fair enough. But I still am going to mention one anyway, even if Ashley already threw some cold water on it.
Sorry.
But you were talking about drill, baby, drill. Something else Donald Trump said today was that Harris might not be able to win Pennsylvania because of her history on fracking policy. We did, though, see a Quinnipiac poll today that shows her up 3 points. Harris, 48, Donald Trump, 45. Do you get nervous looking at polls like that, yes, she may be in the lead in a key blue wall state, but if more focus is paid to her policy positions of the past, that might change real quick?
We're Democrats. We're nervous about everything. We're never not nervous. But no, I think that Pennsylvania is one state where that could affect her. But, the fact of the matter is that the Biden administration has done more domestic energy production, both clean energy and oil and gas, than any other presidency in recent time. So there's a good all of the above energy record for her to stand on. I agree with Ashley. She doesn't need to go out and specify policy proposals down to the legislative mechanism she's going to use. But I expect to hear from her a lot of her vision and her values over the next 89 days. And I think that will give people enough of a sense of what she stands for and what she wants to achieve that they'll be satisfied.
Pennsylvania is one thing. Florida is a very different thing. We saw a poll this week from Suffolk University suggesting that she is in striking distance within the margin here, cutting Donald Trump's lead to just 5 points. And I talked to David Paleologos from Suffolk Polling about this on the early edition of Balance of Power, his theory as to why.
People don't realize this, but Florida has a ballot question on legalized marijuana, recreational marijuana. That's going to drive out young people. They have an abortion rights question, statewide abortion rights question, which is going to drive up women, which will then, by default, will help Kamala Harris's campaign.
Ashley, I don't know if we should be having this conversation with a straight face or not, but it does reinforce the idea that Kamala Harris could be helping to evolve the map.
I don't know if Florida is really the answer. And remember, 3 weeks ago, we were saying Donald Trump was winning all the map as well. So I think that this could go back and forth a million times before November. But I do think the ballot issue is a big concern. In 2004, we ran George Bush's reelect on gay marriage in states like Ohio that was purple then, and other states that actually tipped it to him.
You have abortion and cannabis.
Now you have abortion. I don't even know if cannabis matters. I mean, cannabis is almost all legal everywhere, but abortion's a huge issue in some of these states. Arizona, I think Missouri, now it's on the ballot. That, to me, as a Republican, is very concerning. That's going to drive out voters, and that's going to drive out that 5% that is what we're up against right now. But undecided voters.
Arizona, obviously, is a swing state, and it's one of the many that we're seeing both Trump and Harris pour over $200 million into in terms of advertising just in the month of August. Would it be wise, given the pot of money the Harris campaign has, to just throw a little bit of that toward Florida and its many media markets?
I would not. I think Florida is just a sinkhole for political money. You can't just dip your toe in Florida. If you're going to go into Florida, you have to go all in. I think that states like Arizona and North Carolina are much more winnable for a national Democrat, and I think are much more inclined to tip this year. So that's where I would go first. But the people on the Harris campaign are extremely smart, and they're looking at this really hard. But it's so much money to play in Florida that I have a hard time seeing it.
It's only, 45 media markets, I think, invest in. Taking the bait, that's the idea, right? They get the Harris campaign to spend money where they have no chance to win.
Yeah, and I also think we could solve world hunger with all the money that we're spending on these elections.
It is a very good point. $247 million in ad buys in August.
It's unreal.
And it's only August.
It's not even fall, yeah.
Ashley Davis, Caitlin Legacki, our wonderful political panel this evening. Thank you both so much for joining us. And you, of course, can always get more coverage in the Washington Edition newsletter on the terminal and online.
Thanks for being with us. Catch us in Chicago next week for the DNC. We'll meet you back here tomorrow on Bloomberg TV and radio.